So now I'm going to read an essay. I think it is an essay which is widely famous, and I got a recommendation of that this essay from social media. And the essay name is "The Bad Guys Are Winning," and it's based on. It is written by Annie Applebaums. She's an American journalist, and it's a 21st century is witnessing a reversal of democratic progress, where a network autocracy, that is Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, is winning by cooperating to maintain power. This regime utilizes technology, corruption, mutual support to suppress oppositions, threatening global democracy. Okay, and now the question is, the bad guys are winning. So that lady, that missus, she has labeled them as a bad guy. I'm not exactly sure. Are they bad or are they good? I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying they're good. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just stating the fact that okay, she has labeled them as a bad person. All those people, and so yeah. So this is 16 pages, 16 page of the the essay, and in the it's published in the Atlantic, and the name itself is "The Bad Guys Are Winning," and there's a picture in the background. It's all red. So in so the people, it's just, this is how the psychology plays, right? She has kept the there's a picture of five people, five leaders, and the background is all red, so we usually associate red with the danger. So yeah, there's a picture of five leaders, and the first is the president of Venezuela, Maduro. He was, now he's not, and this essay was written in 2021, and right now it's 2026. So this 5 years there has a significant changes. There's a leadership change in the leadership change, not the regime change, in the Venezuela. So Maduro is right now facing a trial in New York, US. He was captured by US Army. And second, there's the president of the Belarus. And then in the middle, there is Vladimir Putin. He is the president of Russia. And then there is Xi Jinping. He is the president of People's Liberation Army, that is Chinese Communist Party. And then at last, there is Erdogan. He is the president of Turkey. And I want to read this without any biases, and I'll give my opinion. And I just want to give this as a disclaimer that this is my opinion, and my opinion might change. So the problem with me initially was that I don't want to give any opinion, right? Because if I give any opinion and upload it in the YouTube, then later what will happen is that obviously you grow, you become wiser, and later your opinion might change, right? It's not like hard fixed rule that okay, what you have thought in 20s might be the same in the late 90s, when you were like 40, 50, 60s, right? It will change. So I'm not saying that, I'm just saying this is my opinion currently based on the limited knowledge I have. This is my opinion. And with me progressing, reading more, becoming wiser, becoming older, my opinion also might change because of the new information input. So yeah, this is my opinion, and just a disclaimer, not to hurt anyone's opinion. So first is the bad guys are winning. Okay, the bad guys are winning. So I don't think they're bad guys in that sense. Yeah, I mean they've done a lot of horrible things, but so has the leaders of a democracy, country. They have done a lot. They also have done terrible things, right? And also depends on a lot of things. For example, in some places, there are a lot of rights where it is difficult to get a democracy. If there's a democracy, then the country will not improve. So, for example, if you have a dictatorship, the good thing I would say in that sense is that if the dictator is a good person, then there will be a lot of progress in that country, right? Um, but if the dictator is very bad, then it's gonna be very difficult. And second is that I also think that every individual should have a right to speak their freedom, speak freely, freedom of expression, freedom of thoughts, freedom of religions, and this is very this I think you have to compromise if you're living in a autocracy or a dictatorship. Apart from that, I think the problem with the democracy is that democracy where the country is not rich, I think democracy in a rich country is fine, but in a democracy in a poor country, it's a terrible thing, because the poor people, they will suffer, because in a democracy the leadership changes, and the leader at the top, they might not be able to do whatever they want because of the coalition government and all those things, and not might not able to implement a major reforms. And because of that, the country might suffer because of the lack of infrastructures, lack of investments in educations, lack of investments in technology, research and development, all those things. So that's why. But in some dictatorship, the conditions, right? See, okay, I'll this is just my opinion, right? when the when the average people in your country is poor or a below poor, and if there's a lot of poverty in any country, then they will not indulge in any of those things like a civic sense or the country's growth. Their focus is not on the economic growth. Their focus is not on the we need to have a good leadership and all those things. Their main purpose, their main primary is that they need food, right? And for that, they can do anything for that matter, right? So that's why they're not they're not concerned with any of the other things. For example, if there are two leaders, right, in a democracy, I'm talking about the democracy. Even in a democracy, there are a lot of things, right? I'm talking about democracy where the country is poor. If it's a democracy where the country is poor, then the people, the common people who's poor, they will not. If the two leader comes and one the leader talks about the development, the growth, economic growth, infrastructure, and all those things, and then the second leader comes and says that we'll give you a freebies, that means we'll give you like a free 1000, 2000, 3000 any rupees in your bank account, then obviously the in terms of, if you're an educated person, then obviously you'll vote for the first one. But since the common people are not concerned about any of those things, so they will choose the latter one, right? And if you see in a short term, this might help the poor people, but in the long run, what will happen is that they, that leader is making the poor people dependent on the government by paying freely, by not earning those, the payment compensations, right? And in the long run, it becomes very difficult because you have to give them free, everything free, because now they're used to it, right? And then there's no economic growth. The leaders are giving a free money, and then what will happen is that the businessman, right? What do you think, the businessman, how the government is giving the free money? They have to earn somewhere, right? So they have to tax the rich or the people, middle class, the upper middle class. They'll tax those people, and then obviously those people will also get fed up, and then they will start evading taxes, not paying. Or some people, they might leave the country. So it's a long process, and then country will spiral into a low growth and all those things, right? But if it's a dictatorship, and if it's a good dictator, or on an average, then there's no one to question him, right? So they can focus a lot on the infrastructures and all those things, right? But and all in infrastructures, and they will give all the people money, and then it's I'm not saying it's not prevalent, but it's very, it's prevalent, but still it's rare to have a lot of corruption, because people are, the people they fear of the leader, right? They might sack anyone, right? Because he is the sole, the dictator, and he has the authority to dismiss anyone, purge anyone, right? So there's that scarcity, and then second is that there's no one to question him. That also might lead to abusive use of power and all those things. But large and all, I'm giving an example of a dictatorship. For example, in China, if you see the quality of life, if you see on an average the quality of life of people, then China is far better than India in terms of quality of life. I think there would be hardly any few percentage of the people who go to sleep without who go to sleep hungry, right, in China. But in India, if you say, then the percentage is much higher than than China, right? So if in terms of the quality of the life of common people, the China is much better. Even though it's a dictatorship, India, it's much lower, even though it's a democracy. But even if that poor guy is going to sleep hungry, but tomorrow they can wake up and they can just speak freely and do whatever they want, right? They can speak against the government, but you cannot do that same in China. So that's why if you are talking about the poor people, common people, then yeah, to them, I think if your country is largely a common, the poor or the middle class people, then I think dictator works perfectly fine, because the people will not revolt, because the main problem with the people is that the basic needs to be satisfied. But the common people, when they becoming, they starts becoming wealthy, then they will ask for freedom of speech, freedom of expression, more freedom, and that time democracy works better. So this is the, I mean, if you go to integrity, that this is how it, this is how it is, and there's no right or wrong, right? Obviously most of the people might think that, okay, so democracy is better because everyone gets to speak up their mind. But what if a democracy, everyone is able to speak, but poor are not willing to speak because they're not concerned about, they want, what they want to speak and all those things, because their basic conditions are not satisfied. So that's why you see the poor people will not, they are least concerned about the gender equality and all those things, because that those kind of a situation, or those kind of the condition comes only when your basic necessities are met. And then when all your basic necessities are met, securities are met, then you talk about, okay, gender equality and all those things. That's not case with basic people, poor people, right? So that's what I'm saying, right? I'm gonna read this entire thing unbiased, right? Obviously, I do have a little bias with respect to democracy, because I will, I live in a one, but I'll just try to make sure that I read perfectly unbiased, and counter myself on both the sides. Yeah. Now, it's the bad guys are winning. If the 20th century was the story of a slow, so 20th century means it starts from 1901 to 2000s, 1999. If the 20th century was the story of a slow, uneven progress towards the victory of a liberal democracy over the other ideologies, communisms, fascisms, virulent nationalisms, the 21st century is so far a story of the reverse, by Annie Applebaum. I'm sorry, if the pronunciation is wrong. So November 15, 2021. The future of democracy may well be decided in a drab office building on the outskirts of Vilnius, alongside a highway crammed with impatient drivers heading out of a town. I met Svetlana Sikha-Hunoska there this spring in a room that held a conference table, a whiteboard, and not much else. Her team, more than a dozen young journalists, bloggers, and activists, were in the process of changing office. But that wasn't the only reason the space felt stale and perfunctory. None of them, especially not Tsikhanouskaya, really wanted to be in this ugly building or in the Lithuanian capital at all. She is there because she probably won the 2020 presidential election in Belarus, and because the Belarusian dictator, she probably defeated Alexandra Lukashenko, forced her out of the country immediately afterwards. Lithuania offered her asylum. Her husband, Sairye Tsikhanouha, remains imprisoned in Belarus. It is the first thing she said to me. My story, okay, I'll give a little context that the president of the Belarus, the person, not able to pronounce his name, but the name Alexander Lukashenko. He was the president of Belarus since the independence of Belarus. It's since the independence of the country, that is from 1991, 1992 around. So yeah, here's the first thing she said to me. My story is a little bit different from other people. This is what she tells everyone, that hers was not the typical life of a dissident or budding politicians. Before the spring of 2020, she didn't have much time for television or newspaper. She has two children, one of whom was born deaf. Okay, on an ordinary day, she would take them to kindergarten, to doctor, to the park. Then her husband bought a house and ran into the concrete wall of Belarusian bureaucracy and corruption. Expatriated, he started making videos about his experiences and those of others. The video yielded a YouTube channel. The channel attracted thousands of followers. He went around the country recording the frustrations of his fellow citizens, driving a car with the phrase "real news" plastered on the sides. Sikha-Hunoski held up a mirror in his society. People saw themselves in that mirror and responded with the kind of enthusiasm that opposition politicians have found her to create in Belarus. At the beginning, it was really difficult because people were afraid. Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya told me, but step by step, slowly they realized that Sairya isn't afraid. He wasn't afraid to speak the truth as he saw it. His absence of fear inspired others. He decided to run for president. The regime, recognizing the power of Shiari's mirror, would not allow him to register his candidacy, just as it had not allowed him to register the ownership of his house. It ended his campaign and arrested him. Tsikhanouskaya ran in his place. That means his wife ran in the husband's place, with no motive other than to show my love for him. So the police and bureaucrats let her, because what harm could she do in this simple housewife, this woman with no political experiences? So And so in July 2020, she registered as a candidate. So unlike her husband, she was afraid. She woke up so scared every morning, she told me, and sometimes she stayed scared all day long. But she kept going, which was, though she was doesn't say, so incredibly brave. You feel there's a responsibility. You wake up with this pain for those who are in jail. You go to bed with the same feeling. Unexpectedly, Siha no Saka was a success, not despite her inexperiences, but because of her campaign became a campaign about ordinary people standing up to the regime. Two other prominent opposition politicians endorsed her after their own campaigns were blocked, and then when the wife of one of them and the female campaign managers of the others were photographed alongside Siha no Saka, her campaign became something more, a campaign about ordinary women, women who had been neglected, women who had no voice, even just women who loved their husbands. In return, the regime targeted all three of these women. Siha Nowaska received an anonymous letter. Her children would be sent to an orphanage. She dispatched them with her mother abroad to Vilnius and kept campaigning. Okay, I want to know which place is this. Vilnius. Vilnuis. It's in Lithuania. Okay, Lithuania. What is the capital of Lithuania? Capital of Lithuania is equals to. Okay, capital of Lithuania is equals to Vilnius. Vilnius. Okay, it's the capital. She dispatched them with her mother abroad to Vilnius and kept campaigning. On August 9, election official announced that Lukashenko had won 80% of the vote, a number nobody believed. The internet was cut off, and Siha Noa Saka was detained by police and then forced out of the country. Mass demonstration unfolded across Belarus, and this were both a spontaneous outburst of feeling, a popular response to the stolen elections, and a carefully coordinated project run by young people, some based in Warsaw, who had been experimenting with the social media and new forms of communication for several years. For a brief, tantalizing moment, it looked like this democratic uprising might prevail. Belarusians shared a sense of national unity they had never felt before. The regime immediately pushed back with real brutalities, yet the mood at the protest was generally happy. Optimistic people literally danced in the streets. In a country of fewer than 10 million, up to 1.5 million people would come out in a single day. Among them, pensioners, villagers, factory workers, and even in a few places, members of the police and the security services, some of whom removed insignia from their uniform or threw them in a garbage. Siha Noaska says she and many others naively believe that under this pressure, the dictators would just give up. We thought he would understand that we are against him. She told me that people don't want to live under this dictatorship, and he lost the elections. They had no other plan. At first, Lukashenko seemed to have no plan either, but his neighbors did. On August 8, a plane belonging to the FSB, the Russian security service, flew from Moscow to Minsk. Soon after that, Lukashenko tactics underwent a dramatic change. Stephen Biegun, who was the US Deputy Secretary of State at the time, described the change as a shift to more sophisticated, more controlled way to repress the population. Belarus became a textbook example of what the journalist William D. Chomsky had called the dictator's learning curve. Technique that have been used successfully in the past to repress crowd in Russia were seamless transferred to Belarus, along with the personnel who understood how to deploy them. Russian television journalists arrived to replace the Belarusian journalists who had gone on strike and immediately stepped up the campaign to portray the demonstration as the work of Americans and other foreign enemies. So this is the problem with it, right? So because Belarus was previously a part of a USSR, and and Russia is a big country, and so is America. So they both have a Cold War, which was ended, which resulted in the dissolution of a USSR. Now, even there is a even colder, right? Not cold, very very cold war still going on between Russia and this one. So and they play with the neighbors. So that's why even in Belarus, obviously, the United States, they were in a play to change the regime, to let the democracy come in, so that the Russian influence will diminish in that regions. But since Russia has a border with the Belarus, and if American, the regimes or American supported regime comes to the place, then it's their national security problem, because they don't want Americans at their doorstep. So they also have to act it, and they also support that regime because they want a stable place, right? A buffer zone, a sort of. So that's why even they will help. So that's why obviously they will exactly. This is what Russia will say, that there's America behind it, and America will say that there's Russia behind it, and it's true. Both are true. Russian police appear to have supplemented their Belarusian colleague, or at least give them advice and policy of selective arrest began. Vladimir Putin figured out a long time ago, mass arrests are unnecessary. If you can jail, torture, or possibly murder just a few key people, the rest will be frightened into staying home. Eventually, they will become apathetic because they believe nothing can change. The Lukashenko rescue package, reminiscent of the one Putin had designed for Bashar al-Assad in Syria 60 years earlier, contained economic elements too. Russian companies offered markets for Belarusian products that have been banned by the democratic West. For example, smuggling Belarusian cigarettes into the European Union. Some of this was possible because the two countries share a language. Though roughly a third to half of the country speaks Belarus, most public business in Belarus is conducted in Russian. But this was close cooperation was also possible because Lukashenko and Putin, though they famously dislike each other, share a common way of seeing the world. Both believe that their personal survival is more important than the well-being of the people. Both believe that a change of regime would result in their death and imprisonment or exile. Both also learned lessons from the Arab Springs as well as from the more distant memory of 1989, when communist dictatorship felt like a dominoes. Democratic revolutions are contagious. If you can stamp them out in one country, you might prevent them from starting in others. The anti-corruption, pre-democracy demonstration of 2014 in Ukraine, which resulted in the overthrow of the President Viktor Yanukovych government and reinforced this fear of democratic contagions. Putin was enraged by those protests, not least because of the president. They said, after all, if Ukraine could get rid of the corrupt dictators, why wouldn't Russia want to do the same? Lukashenko gladly accepted Russian help, turned against his people, and transformed himself from an autocratic, patriarchal grandfather, a kind of a national collective farm bosses, into a tyrant who revels in cruelty. Reassured by Putin's support, he began breaking new grounds to not just selective arrest. A year later, a human rights activist says that more than 800 political prisoners remain in jail. But torture, not just torture, but rape, not just torture and rape, but kidnapping and quite possibly murder. Lukashenko's sneering defiances of the rule of law. He issues a stony-faced denial of the existence of political repression in his country and of anything resembling decency spread beyond his borders. In May 2021, Belarusian air traffic control forced an Irish-owned Ryanair passenger plane to land in Minsk so that one of the passengers, Roman Protasevich, a young dissident living in exile, could be arrested. He later made public confessions on television that appeared to be coerced. In August, another young dissident still living in exile, Vitaly Shishov, was found hanged in Kiev Park. At about the same time, Lukashenko regime set out to destabilize its EU neighbors by forcing streams of refugees across their borders. Belarus lured Afghan and Iraqi refugees to Minsk with the proffer of tourist visas, then escorted them to the border of Lithuania, Poland, and forced them at the gunpoint to cross illegally. I don't know why these people like Afghanistan people, Iranian people, Iraqi people, Pakistani people, Bangladeshi people, don't they have their own dignity? Why they get sold or purchased by other country? Other countries should treat them as an expendable, people, right? They don't care if you die. They just pay. And why do you want to do that, man? Why? Lukashenko began to act, in other words, as if he were untouchable both at home and abroad. He began breaking not only the laws and customs of his own country, but also the laws and custom of other countries and of the international community laws regarding air traffic control, homicide, borders, exile, flowed out of the country. Tsikhanouskaya teams scrambled to book hotel room on or Airbnbs in Vilnius to find means of support to learn new languages. Tsikhanouskaya herself had to make another, even more difficult transitions from people's choice candidates to a sophisticated diplomat. This time, her inexperience initially worked against her. At first, she thought that if she could just speak with Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron, one of them could fix the problem. I was assured they were so powerful that they can call Lukashenko and say, "Stop, how dare you," she told me, but they could not. So she tried to, obviously, they don't want to, have a bad relation with other people also, right? So she tried to talk as a foreign leader did, to speak in a sophisticated political language. That didn't work either. That experience was demoralizing. It was very difficult sometimes to talk about your people, about their suffering, and see the emptiness in the eyes of those who are talking to you or talking to. She began using the plain English that she had learned in school in order to convey plain English. I started to tell stories that would touch their hearts. I tried to make them feel just a little of the pain that Belarusian feel. Now she tells anyone who will listen exactly what she told me. I am an ordinary person, a housewife and a mother of a two, and I'm in politics because other ordinary people are being beaten naked in prison cells. What she wants is sanctions, democratic unity, pressures on the regime, anything that will raise the cost for Lukashenko to stay in power, or for Russia to keep him in power, anything that might induce the business and security elites in Belarus to abandon him, anything that might pursue it for China and Iran to keep out. To our surprise, Tsikhanouskaya became, for the second time, a runaway success. She charmed Merkel and Macron and the diplomats of multiple countries. In July, she met President Joe Biden, who subsequently broadened American sanctions on Belarus to include major companies in several industries: tobacco, potash, constructions, and their executive. The EU had already banned a range of people, companies, and technologies from Belarus after the Ryanair, Ryanair kidnapping. The EU and the UK banned their Belarusian national airline as well. What was once a booming trade between Belarus and Europe has been reduced to a trickle. Tsikhanouskaya inspired people to make sacrifice of their own. The Lithuanian foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, told me that this country was proud to host her, and even if it meant trouble on the borders, if we are not free to invite other free people into our country because it's somehow not safe, then the question is, can we consider ourselves free? Tsikhanouskaya had acquired many other supports and admirers. She has not only the talented young activist in Vilnius, but a colleague in Poland and Ukraine as well. I want to pronounce it properly. Tsikhanouskaya. She promotes values that unites millions of her compatriots, including pensioners like Nina Bahin Saka, a great grandmother who had been filmed shouting at the police, and ordinary working people like Sierra Hardzia, a 50-year-old journalist from a provincial town. Trahichia, who was convicted of insulting the president. On her side, she also has the friends and relatives of hundreds of political prisoners who, like her own husband, are paying high prices just because they want to live in a country with free elections. Most of all, though, Tsikhanouskaya has on her side the combined narrative power of what we used to call the free world. She has the language of human rights, democracy, justice. She has the NGOs and human rights organizations that worked inside the United Nations and other international institutions to put pressures on an autocratic regime. She has the support of the people around the world who still fervently believe that the politics can be made more civilized, more rational, more humane, who can see in her an authentic representative of that cost. But will that be enough? A lot depends on the answer. All of us have in our mind a cartoon image of what an autocratic state looks like. There is a bad man at the top. He controls the police. The police threatens the people with violence. They are evil collaborators, and some maybe brave descendants. But in the 21st century, that cartoon bear little resemblance to reality. Nowadays, autocracies are not run by one bad guy, but by a sophisticated network composed of a kleptocratic financial structures, security services, military, police, paramilitary groups, surveillance, and professional propagandists. So the members of these networks are connected not only within a given country, but among many countries. The corrupt state-controlled companies in one dictatorship do business with corrupt state-controlled companies in another. The police in one country can arm, equip, and train the police in another. The propagandists shared resources. The troll farms that promotes one dictator's propaganda can also be used to promote the propaganda of another. And the theme, pounding the same message by the weakness of the democracy and the evil of America. This is not to say that there is some super secret room where bad guys meet, just as in a James Bond's movie. Nor does the new autocratic alliance have a unifying ideology. Among modern autocrats are the people who call themselves communist, nationalist, and theocrats. No country leads this group. Washington likes to talk about Chinese influence, but what really bonds the members of this club is a common desire to preserve and enhance their personal power and wealth. Unlike military or political alliances from other times and places, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc, but rather like agglomerations of companies. Call it autocracy INC. Their links are creamy, cemented not by ideals but by deals designed to take the edge of the Western economic boycotts or to make the personal rich, which is why they can operate across geographical and historical lines. But just reading till now, I think it does seem to me that she is a very idealist person, which means that she believes in something like, okay, this is how it should be, and doesn't care about what it is right now. And just remember this, right? In life, and in reality, right? What should be will not always be true. And I think not just true, more than 90% of the time, what should be is not the norm, right? It's completely different. We have to accept the reality, and then based on that, we have to react. And this was written in 2011. I'm actually very, curious to just dig more of her, interviews or podcast, if available, of the recent. I want to see her reactions of the Donald Trump, because that guy has done so a lot of damages to the American, especially from the point of view of a leftist. From the right, they say that he has not done anything wrong, but from the left, to me, she does seem to me like a left person. I want to see her reactions. I think she might have gone mad just looking at the terms, the way the Trump conducts his foreign policies and all. Okay, and unlike military or political alliances from this one, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc, but rather like agglomerations. Their link is similar. Okay, so thus in theory, Belarus is an international pariah. Belarusian planes cannot land in Europe. Many Belarusian goods cannot be sold in the US. Belarus, shocking brutality has been criticized by many international institutions, but in practice, the country remains a respected member of the autocracy INC. Despite Lukashenko's flagrant flouting of international norms, despite his reaching across borders to break laws, Belarus remains the site of one of China's largest overseas development projects. Iran has expanded its relationship with Belarus over the past year. Cuban officials have expressed their solidarity with Lukashenko at the UN, calling for an end to foreign interference in the foreign affairs. In theory, Venezuela too is an international pariah. Since 2008, the US has repeatedly added more Venezuelan to personal sanction list. Since 2019, US citizens and companies have been forbidden to do any business there. Canada, the EU, and many of the Venezuela's South American neighbors to maintain sanctions on the country. And yet, Nicolas Maduro's regime received loan as well as oil investment from Russia, China, Turkey, facilitates the illicit Venezuelan gold trades. Cuba has long provided security advisors as well as a security technology to the country's rulers. The international narcotics trade keeps individual members of the regime well supplied with designer shoes and handbags. Leopoldo Lopez, a one-time star of the opposition now living in the exile in Spain, has observed that although Maduro's opponents have received some foreign assistance, it's nothing comparable to what Maduro has received. Like the Belarusian opposition, the Venezuelan opposition has charismatic leaders and dedicated grassroots activists who have persuaded millions of people to go out into the streets and protest. If their only enemy was the corrupt, bankrupt Venezuelan regime, they might win. But Lopez and his fellow descendants are, in fact, fighting multiple autocrats in multiple countries, like so many other ordinary people propelled into politics by the experience of injustice, like Svetlana and Sayer Tsihanovsky in Belarus, like the leaders of the extraordinary Hong Kong protest movement, like the Cubans and the Iranians and the Burmese pushing for democracy in their countries. They are fighting against people who control state companies and can make investment decisions worth billions of dollars for purely political reasons. They're fighting against people who can buy sophisticated surveillance technology from China or robots from St. Petersburg. Above all, they are fighting against people who have inured themselves to the feeling and opinion of their countrymen as well as the feeling and opinion of everybody else, because autocracy and grants its member not only the money and security but also something less tangible and yet as important, impunity. The leader of the Soviet Union, the most powerful autocracy in the second half of the 20th century, cared deeply about how they were perceived around the world. They vigorously promoted the superiority of their political system and they objected to when it was criticized. When the Soviet leaders, Nikita Khrushchev famously brandished his shoe at meeting of the UN General Assembly in 1960, it was because the Filipino delegates had expressed sympathy for the peoples of Eastern Europe and elsewhere which have been deprived of the free exercise of their civil and political rights. Today, the most brutal members of autocracy INC don't much care if their countries are criticized or by whom. The leaders of the Myanmar don't really have any ideology beyond nationalism, self-enrichment, the desire to remain in power. The leaders of Iran confidently discounts the views of Western infidels. The leaders of Cuba, Venezuela dismiss the statements of foreigners on the grounds that they are imperialist. The leaders of China have spent a decade disputing the human rights language long used by international institutions, successfully convincing many people around the world that these Western concepts don't apply to them. Russia has gone beyond merely ignoring foreign criticisms to outright mocking it. After the Russian dissidents, Alexei Navalny was arrested earlier this year, Amnesty International designated him as prisoners of conscience, a venerable term that the Human Rights Organization has been using in the 1960s. Russian social media trolls immediately mounted a campaign designed to draw Amnesty attention to a 15-year-old statement by Navalny that seems to break the group's rules on offensive language. Amnesty took the bait and removed the title. Then when Amnesty officials realized that they had been manipulated by the trolls, the restored Russian state media cracked derisively. It was not a good moment for the human rights movement. Impervious to international criticism, modern autocrats are using aggressive tactics to push back against mass protest and widespread discontent. Putin was unembarrassed to stage elections earlier this year, in which some 9 million people were buried from being candidates. The pro-government party received 5 times more television coverage, all other parties put together. Television clips of the official stealing votes circulated online, and vote counts were mysteriously altered. The Burmese junta is unashamed to have murdered hundreds of protesters, including young teenagers, from the streets of Yangon. The Chinese government boasts about its destruction of the popular democracy movement in the Hong Kong. I don't know, but I've rarely seen any person who is against Putin apart from the Western countries. Honestly, not even I'm not seen even a single Russian, right, in an interview who's outside Russia talking bad about the Putin. Even in India, they don't talk bad about the Russians, right? But I don't know, man. Honestly, I actually don't think that the president of the Russia, right, I do agree with the fact that they are not democracy. Even if they say that we are a democracy, we give every candidates an equal chance to being elected as a president. No, I don't think they do. But that doesn't mean that the quality of life and the infrastructures they have is not bad. The quality of a life of a common people is far better than most of the countries, right? And honestly, I've not seen even a single, like, a proper person who is who's saying that what Vladimir Putin has done to Russia has done has done a big damage to Russia. No, I've not heard but a proper argument about it at all. Even in India, there's a lot of people who admire him. So I've only seen Western countries, especially Europeans and um, European and the United States. Not even in the United States, right? Some people admire him, especially the right. So the left are the people. Even Donald Trump, I've not heard even a single bad thing about bad thing that he has that Donald Trump has talked about the Putin. I don't think. At the extreme, this kind of a contempt can devolve into what the international democracy activist Sharja Povovic calls the Maduro model of governance, which may be what Lukashenko is preparing for the Belarus. Autocrats can adopt it or are willing to pay the price of becoming a totally failed country to see their country enter a category of a failed state, accepting economic collapse, isolation, and mass poverty. If that's what it takes to stay in power, Assad has applied the Maduro model in Syria, and it seems to be what the Taliban leadership has, had in mind this summer when they occupied Kabul and immediately began arresting and murdering Afghan officials and civilians. Financial collapse was looming, but they didn't care. As one Western official working in the region told the Financial Times, they assume that any money that the West doesn't give them will be replaced by China, Pakistan, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. And if the money doesn't come, so what? Their goal is not flourishing, prosperous in Afghanistan, but in Afghanistan where they are in charge. The widespread adoption of a Maduro model helps explain why Western statements at the time of Kabul's fall sounded so pathetic. The EU foreign policy chief expressed deep concerns about reports of serious human violations and called for meaningful negotiation based on democracy, the rule of law, and a constitutional rule, as if the Taliban was interested in any of that. Whether it was a deep concern, sincere concern, or a profound concern, whether it was expressed on behalf of Europe or the Holy See, none of it mattered. Statement like that mean nothing to the Taliban, the Cuban security services, or the Russian FSB. Their goal are money and personal power. They're not concerned deeply, sincerely, profoundly, or otherwise about the happiness or well-being of their fellow citizens, let alone the views of anyone else. How have modern autocrats achieved such impunity in part by persuading so many other people in so many other countries, to play along? Some of those people and some of those countries might surprise you. If the stories told you by the young descendants in Vilnius make you angry, the story told by the Uyghurs of Istanbul will haunt your dreams. I don't know how to pronounce it. Uyghurs, right? So UIG, Uyghurs pronunciation, okay. Uyghurs. Uyghur is Uyghur, right? So it's Uyghur. So it is pronounced as Uyghur. Uyghurs, right? Okay, it's a ethnic group. Uyghur is generally pronounced as this one. Okay, so Uyghur, right? Okay, it's Uyghurs. Uyghurs are Turkic-speaking, predominantly Muslim ethnic group, numbering around 12 to 11 million, natively residing in the Xinjiang Uyghur autonomous region of northwest China. Since 2017, they have been subjected to severe crackdown by the Chinese government with international accusation of genocides, forced labor, detentions, and all those things, right? And okay, where was I? If the story is told by the young descendants of the Vilnius will make you angry, the story is told by the Uyghurs of Istanbul will haunt your dreams. A few months ago, in a hot airless apartment over a dress shop, I met Kalbinur Tursans. She was dressed in a dark green gown with its ruffled sleeves. Her face, framed by a tightly drawn hand in headscarf, resembled that of a saint in medieval triptych. Her small daughter in Mickey Mouse legging played with an electronic tablet while we spoke. Third son is Uyghur, a member of Chinese, predominantly Muslim Chinese minority born in the territory that is Chinese called Xinjiang, and many Uyghurs known as the East, Turkestans. Tursan has had 6 children, too many in a country where there are strict rules limiting birth. Also, she wanted to raise them as a Muslim. That too was a problem in China when she became pregnant. Again, she feared being harassed by the police, as a woman with more than two children often are. She and her husband decided to move to Turkey. They got passport for themselves and for the youngest child, but were told the other passports would take longer. Because of her pregnancy, the three of them came to Istanbul anyway after she and her daughter were settled. Her husband returned for the rest of the family. Then he disappeared. That was 5 years ago. Tursun has not spoken with her husband since in July 2017. She spoke with her sister, who promised to take care of her remaining children. Then they lost contact. A few weeks, after that, tourists came across a video, being passed around a WhatsApp, shot at what appeared to be a Chinese orphanage. It showed Uyghur children heads shaved and all dressed alike, learning to speak Chinese. On one of the children were her daughter Aisha. Tursun showed me the video of her daughter, and she also showed me a picture of her husband standing in an Istanbul mosque. She cannot speak to either one of them, or to any of the rest of her children in China. She has no way to know what they are thinking. They might not know she has searched for them. They might believe she has abandoned them on purpose. They might have forgotten she exists. Meanwhile, time is passing. The child in the Mickey Mouse legging who sang to herself while we talked is the one born in Turkey. She has never met her father or her brother or brothers and or sisters in China, but she knows something is very wrong. When Tursun fell silent for a moment, overcome with emotions, the girl put down her tablets and put her arms around her mother's neck. Sinister though it sounds, Tursun's story is not unique. The translators for many of my conversations with the Tursun was Nursiman Abdurshid. She is also a Uyghur, also from Xinjiang, also married, also with a daughter, and also lives, also now living in Istanbul. Abdurshid came to Turkey as a student, convinced that she had the backing of the Chinese states. A graduate of Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, she had studied business administrations, learned excellent Turkish and English, made ethnic Chinese friends. She had never thought of herself as a rebel or a descendant. Why would she behave? She was a Chinese success story. Abdur Shid break with her old child came in at 2017 when, after an ordinary conversation with her family in China, they stopped answering her calls. She texted and got no response. Weeks passed. After many months, she contacted the consulate in Istanbul. She asked a Turkish friend to call for her mother. An official there finally told her the truth. Her father and mother and younger brother were in prison camps. Each were preparing to commit terrorist activities. A similar charge was thrown at Jalvan Sherman, another Uyghur student in Istanbul, like Adurshid. He realized something was wrong when his mother and other relatives stopped responding to texts. They blocked him on WeChat, the Chinese messaging app. Nearly 2 years later, he learned that they were in prison camp. Chinese diplomats accused him of having anti-Chinese contacts in Egypt as well. Sherman and told them that they had never been haven't been to Egypt. Prove it. They responded. They narrated, cooperate with us, tell us who all your friends are, list every place you have ever been, become an informer. He refused, and though not temperamentally inclined to be a descendant either, decided to speak out on social media instead. I had remained silent, but my silence didn't protect my family, he told me. Turkey is home to some 50,000 exiled Uyghurs, and there are dozens, hundreds, perhaps thousands of such stories there. Elias Dogan, the Turkish lawyer who has presented some of the Uyghurs, told me that till 2017, very few of them were politically active. But after friends and relatives began disappearing into re-education camps, concentration camps, in fact, set up by the Chinese states, the situation changed. Tursun and a group of other women who had lost their child staged a protest walk from Istanbul to Ankara, a distance of more than I think Turkey is the capital. Ankara is the capital of Turkey. Okay, a distance of more than 270 miles, and then stood in front of a UN building, demanding to be heard. Abur initiated spoke at the conference of one of the Turkish opposition parties. I haven't heard my mother's voice for 4 years. She told the audience. A video of this speech went viral when she had lunch at a restaurant in Uyghur's neighborhoods. Waiters recognized her and thanked her for it. In another era, in a world with different geopolitical configurations, at a time when the language of human right had not been so comprehensively undermined, dissidents would have plenty of official empathy in Turkey, a nation that is singularly linked to the Uyghur community by ties of religion, ethnicity, and language. And for 2009, even before the concentration camp were opened, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who was then the Turkish prime minister, called the Chinese repressions of the Uyghurs a genocide. In 2012, he brought businessman with him to Xinjiang and promised to invest in Uyghur businesses there. He did this because it was popular to extent that ordinary Turks knows what is happening in the Uyghur cousin they sympathize. Yet since then, Erdogan, who became president in 2014, he has himself turned against the rule of law, independent media, and independent court at homes, as he has become openly hostile to former European and NATO allies, and as he has arrested, jailed his own dissidents. Erdogan interest in Chinese friendships, investment and technology has increased along with his willingness to echo Chinese propaganda. On 100th anniversary of a Chinese Communist Party, his party's flagship newspaper published a long solemn article which was in fact sponsored content beneath the headline "The Chinese Communist Party: 100 Years of Glorious History and the Secrets of its Success." Alongside these changes, the government policy towards the Uyghur has shifted to. In recent years, the Turkish government has surveilled and detained Uyghur on bogus terrorism charges and deported some, including four who were sent to Tajikistan and then immediately turned over to China in 2019. Still in Istanbul, I met one Uyghur. He preferred to remain anonymous, who had spent time in Turkish detention centers along with some of his family, following what he said were bogus charges of terrorism. To the presence of pro-Chinese forces in Turkish media, politics and business has been growing, and lately they are keen to belittle the Uyghurs. Curiously, Abu Shih's speech was cut from the public television broadcast of the opposition party conference she attended. After it started circulating on social media, she was publicly attacked by the Turkish politicians. Dogu, Berenkik, a former Maoist who is a pro-Chinese to anti-Westerns and quite influential after Penrik described her as a terrorist on television's, a wave of online attack followed. The atmosphere worsened in late 2020s when a delayed Chinese shipment of COVID-19 vaccine coincided with the Beijing pressures from Turkey to sign an extradition treaty that would have made deportations of Uyghurs even easier. After opposition parties objected, both the Turkish and the Chinese government denied that delivery of the vaccine shipment was in any way conditioned on deporting Uyghurs, but the timing remained suspicious. Several Uyghurs in Istanbul told me that corrupt elements in the Turkish police work directly with the Chinese already. They have no proof. And Dogon, the Turkish lawyer, told me that he doubts this is the case. Still, he thinks that despite all of the old cultural ties, the Turkish government might not mind if the Uyghurs stopped protesting or quietly moved elsewhere. For the moment, the Uyghurs in Turkey are still protected by what remain of a democracy there. The opposition parties, some of the media, public opinion, a government that faces democratic elections, even skewed ones, must still take these things into account. In countries where opposition media and public opinion matters less, the balance is different. You can see this even in Muslim countries, which might be expected to object the oppression of the Muslim. Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan has stated boldly that we accept the Chinese versions of we accept the Chinese versions of the Chinese Uyghur disputes. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Egyptians have all allegedly arrested, detained, and deported Uyghurs without much discussions. Not coincidentally, these are all countries that seek good economic relation with China, and that have purchased Chinese surveillance technology for autocrats and would be autocrats around the world. The Chinese, after offer a package that looks something like this, agree to follow Chinese lead on Hong Kong, debate the Uyghurs and human rights more broadly, buy Chinese surveillance equipments, accept massive Chinese investment, preferably into companies you personally control or that at least pay you kickbacks, then sit back and relax knowing that however bad your image becomes in the eyes of the international human rights community, you and your friends will remain in power. And how different are we Americans, we Europeans? Are we so sure that our institutions, our political parties, our media could never be manipulated in the same way? In the spring of 2016, I helped publish a report on the Russian use of disinformation in Central and Eastern Europe. The now familiar Russian efforts to manipulate political conversations in other countries using social media, fake websites, funding for extreme parties, hacked private communications, and more. My colleague Edward Lucas, a senior fellow at the Centers for the European Policy Analysis, and I took it to Capitol Hills, to the State Departments, and to anyone in Washington who listens. The response was polite interest, nothing more. We are very sorry that Slovakia and Slovenia are having the problems, but it can't happen here. A few months later, it did happen here. Russian trolls operating from the St. Petersburg sought to shift the outcome of an American elections in much the same way they had done in Central Europe, using fake Facebook pages, sometimes impersonating anti-immigration groups, sometimes impersonating black activists, fake Twitter accounts, and attempts to infiltrate in a group like the National Rifle Association, as well as weaponizing hacked material from the Democratic National Committee. Some American actively welcomed these interventions and even sought to take advantage of what they imagine might be broader Russian technical capabilities. If it's what you say, I love you. If it's what you say, I love it. Donald Trump wrote to an intermediary for a Russian lawyer who he believed he had access to damaging information about Hillary Clinton. In 2008, Trump Jr. had told a business conference that Russians make up a pretty disproportionate cross sections of a lot of our assets. In 2016, Russia's long-term investments in the Trump business empire paid off. In the Trump family, the Kremlin had something better than spies, cynical, nihilistic, indebted long-term allies. Despite the raw, fierce national debate on Russian election interference, we don't seem to have learned much from it. If our thinking about Chinese influence operation is any indication, the United Front is the Chinese Communist Party influence project, subtler and more strategic than the Russian versions, designed not to upend democratic politics, but to shape the nature of conversations about China and around the world. Among other endeavors, the United Front creates educational and exchange programs, tries to mold the atmosphere within the Chinese exile communities, and quote anyone willing to be a de facto spokesperson for China. But in 2019, when Peter Mortis, a Chinese expert and democracy promoter, tried to discuss the United Front program with the CIA analyst, he got the same kind of a polite dismissal that Lucas and I had heard a few years earlier. This is not Australia, the CIA analyst told him. According to testimony Mattis gave to Congress, referring to a series of scandals involving Chinese and Chinese Australian business people allegedly attempting to buy political influence in Canberra. We are now sorry that Australia is having these problems, but it can't happen here, can't it? Controversy has already engulfed many of the Chinese-funded, Confucius institutes set up at American universities. Some of whose faculty, under the guise of offering benign Chinese language and calligraphy courses, got involved in the efforts to shape the academic debates in China's favor. A classic United Front enterprises, the long arms of the Chinese states have reached Chinese dissidents in the U.S. as well. The Washington D.C. and Maryland office of the of the Wei Xingshan Foundations, a group named after one of the Chinese most famous democracy activists, have been broken into more than a dozen times in the past 2 decades. Siping Huang, the foundation's executive director, told me that the old computers have disappeared, phone lines have been cut, and mails have been thrown into the toilets. The main objective seems to be to let the activists know what someone was there. Chinese democracy activists living in the USA have, like the U-August in Istanbul, been visited by Chinese agents who tried to persuade them or blackmail them or returned home. Still, others have had a strange car accident. Mishaps regularly happen, while others are their way to attend an annual ceremony held in New York on the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacres. Chinese influence, like authoritarian influence more broadly, can take even subtler forms to using carrot rather than sticks. If you go along with the official line, if you don't criticize China's human rights records, opportunities will emerge for you. In 2018, McKinsey held a tone-deaf, deaf corporate retreat in Kashgar, just a few miles away from Uyghur internment camp. The same kind of a camp where the husband, parents, and siblings of Tursans, Shirmanst, and Abu Rashid have been imprisoned. McKinsey had good reasons not to talk about human rights at the retreat. According to the New York Times, the consulting giant at the time of the event advised 22 of the 100 largest Chinese state companies, including one of that helped construct the artificial island in the South China Sea, that have alarmed the US military. But perhaps it's unfair to pick up on McKinsey. The list of major American corporations caught in tangled webs of personal, financial, and business links to China, Russia, and other autocracies is very long. During the heavily manipulated and deliberately confusing Russian elections in the September 2021, both Apple and Google removed apps that have been designed to help Russian voters decide which opposition candidates to select. After Russian authorities threatened to prosecute the company's local employee, the apps have also been created by Alexei Navalny anti-corruption movement, the most viable option movement in the country, which was itself not allowed to participate in the election campaign. Navalny, who remains in prison on a ludicrous charges, made a statements by Twitter, excoriating American democracy most famous corporate moguls. The list of other industries that might be similarly described as cowardly and greedy is also very long, extending even to Hollywood, pop music, and sports. When distributors became nervous about the possible Chinese backlash to 2012 MGM make of a Cold Era movie that recast the Soviet invaders as Chinese, the studio had the film digitally altered to make the bad guys North Korean instead. In 2019, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, along with the number of basketball stars, expressed remorse to China after the general managers of the Houston Rocket tweeted support for Democrats of the Hong Kong. Even more abject was Kuzak History of the Golden Man, a fawning 8-hour documentary about the life of the Nursultan Nazarbayev, the brutal long-time ruler of Kazakhstan, produced in 2021 by the Hollywood director Oliver Stone. Or consider what the rapper Nicki Minaj did in 2015 when she was criticized for giving a concert in Angola, hosted by the company co-owned by the daughter of that country's dictators, Jose Ecuador dos Santos. Minaj posted 2 photos of her on Instagram, one in which she is wrapped in the Angola flag and another alongside the dictator's daughters, captioned with his immortal words, "Oh, no big deal. She's just the 8th richest woman in the world. At least that's what I was told by someone before we took this photo. Lol. Yikes, girl power. This motivates me so much. If the autocrats and the kleptocrats felt no shame." Kleptocrats means the people, small people who just fine. Okay, I want to see. Kleptomania means the person who steals, right? Kleptocrats is a leader or government official who uses their power to steal state resources and personal wealth. Kleptocrats.
Kleptocrat.
Yeah, kleptocrats. So Okay, and no shame. Why should American celebrities who profit from their largesses should why should their fans, why should their sponsors? If the 20th century was the story of a slow, uneven struggle ending with the victory of the liberal democracy over the ideologies, communism and fascism, virulent nationalisms, the 21st century is so far a story of the reverse. Freedom House, which has published an annual Freedom in the World report for nearly 50 years, called its 2021 edition Democracy Under Siege. The Stanford scholar Larry Diamond calls this an era of democratic vocations. Not everyone is equally gloomy. Sergej Popovic, the democracy activist, argues that the confrontations between autocrats and their populations are growing harsher precisely because democratic movements are becoming more articulate and better organized. But just about everyone who thinks hard about the subject argues that the old diplomats' toolbox once used to support democrats around the world is rusty and out of date. Tactic that used to work no longer do. Certainly, sanctions, especially when hastily applied in the aftermath of some outrage, do not have the impact they once did. They can sometimes seem, as Stephen Biguin, the former deputy secretary of state, puts it, an exercise in itself. It's in self gratifications on par with the sternly worded condemnations of the last farcical elections. It doesn't mean they have no impact at all. But although personal sanctions on corrupt Russian officials might make it impossible for some Russians to visit their homes in Cap Ferret says, or the children at the London School of Economics, they haven't persuaded Putin to stop invading other countries and interfering in European and American politics or poisoning his own dissidents. Neither have decades of U.S. sanctions changed the behavior of Iranian regime or Venezuelan regime. Despite their indisputable economic impact, too often sanctions are allowed to deteriorate over time. Just as often, autocracies now help one another get around them. America does still spend money on projects that might loosely be called democracy assistance, but the amount are very low compared to what the authoritarian world is prepared to put up. The National Endowment for Democracy, a unique institution that has an independent board, of which I am a member, received $300 million of congressional funding in 2020 to support the civic organizations, non-state media, and education project in about 100 autocracies and weak democracies around the world. So this is the problem now comes in, right? Again, I'm telling you, there's no right or wrong. There's a shades of gray, and you have to see from which point you're talking about, right? From which point you're talking about. If you're talking about the normal American people, then you might say that, why am I paying? Okay, yeah. So why am I paying? Because they are paying the taxes, right? Why am I paying for the common American? Why am I paying for the other for the democracies of the other countries? I don't care, right? Because I would rather want you government to fix our United States government's problem of the money that's being invested in democracy to get the democracy in other countries. Why invest in other countries? Invest in our own country, right? Then there are some people who say that we have to invest in other countries to get the democracy because that is the right thing to do. No, I don't think America believes in this. First, what they want is that they want to maintain their hegemony, and they want to be the global superpower. They want to maintain it, and for that you need to be like you have to act like a policeman in the world, and that's not easy. You have to spend a lot of money, and for that you need to ensure that you have a good connections or a relationship with other countries, foreign countries. And if you don't have a good relation with those countries, then what the playbook of America is to change the regime, the top governments, and install someone who is a puppet or a person who will listen to the United States. And that's not what democracy is about, is it? So yeah, so there's a lot of flawed in even that thing also. So received $300 million of congressional funding in 2020 to support civic organization, non-state media, and education project in about 100 autocracies and weak democracies around the world. Even in India, right, there are a lot of NGOs who are supported by the if you see the the roots, right, you might not necessarily see directly that okay, he's being supported by this country, but if you see all the NGOs, they're supported by other NGOs, and ultimate when you see the main source, the root, right, it is some businessman in the United States who wants to control the entire narrative, like George Soros Foundations, which wants to change which not necessarily this one those foundations, right, in India, those not necessarily work in the interest of India's national interest, because the funds are being given from by the United States, and obviously they will put some conditions, right? So that's the thing. So it's very difficult, right? So even in, if you see some protest, some riots, for example, I'll give it a, I'll give you a like illusionary example, not the real example. So for example, if India wants to develop some a big weapon or mass infrastructure or a big navy or any of those things, which might affect directly or indirectly to the interest in a long term for the United States, then those NGOs will oppose it because they are paid to do so, right? And they will oppose it, and then what will happen is that the growth, and then there'll be a lot of activist protest, a lot of things, and then the progress will be slow. That is exactly what they do, right? Most of the NGOs. I'm not saying that all NGOs are bad. Obviously, there are some good NGOs which help the people, but you have to see the ulterior motive, right? What is their motive, main motive? It's not to help. I mean, if you see largely, right, those NGOs are there to just just put that pressure, or just to consider it as a hegemonic way to soft power to manipulate the country. So yeah, unique this ones. And American foreign language broadcasters have, having survived the Trump administration, still inexplicable attempt to destroy them, also continue to serve as independent source of information in some closed societies. But while Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty spend just over $22 million on Russian language broadcasting. To take one example, every year, Voice of America just over $8 million more. The Russian government spends billions on the Russian language state media that are seen and heard all over the Eastern Europe, from Germany to Moldova. Where is Moldova? I think I've heard of this a lot of time. Moldova. Okay, it's a country. It's a Romania. Is it Moldova? Okay, it's a country. Okay, it's a country. Moldova. What is the capital? Okay, Chisinau. Moldova. Okay. Okay, to Moldova, to Kazakhstan, the $33 million the Radio Free Asia spends to broadcast in Burmese, Cantonese, Khmer, Korean, Lao, Mandarin, Tibetan, Uyghur, Vietnamese pales, beside the billions the Chinese spends on media and communication both inside its borders and around the world. I know, right? So even in our Tibetan community, there is in United States there is a Radio Free Asia, which is being funded by the United States government. So for us, it is good that we are able to get the voice out. But if you see from the Chinese perspective, it is not. It is it is a direct it is in a direct conflict with the China, right? Because they are saying that Tibetans are not an independent country, but the United States is supporting all those things. So yeah, if you see from China's perspective, they will not like it, obviously, right? But yeah, it depends on who you are talking in from the perspective of. Our efforts are even smaller than they look, because traditional medias are only a part of how modern autocracies promotes themselves. We don't yet have a real answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which offers infrastructure deals to countries around the globe, often enabling local leaders to skim kickbacks and garnering positive China subsidized media coverage in returns. We don't have the equivalent of a United Fronts or any other strategy for shaping debates within and about the China. We don't run online influence campaigns inside Russia. We don't have an answer to the disinformation injected by the troll farms report that circulates on Facebook inside the US, let alone a plan for countering this information on circulation inside autocracies. President Biden is well aware of this imbalance and says he wants to reinvigorate the democratic alliances and America's leading role in the to that end, the president is convening an online summit on December 9 and 10 to galvanize commitments and initiative in aid of the three themes: defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruptions, and promoting respect for human rights. That sounds nice, but unless it heralds deep changes in our own behavior, it means very little. Fighting corruption is not just a foreign policy issue. After all, if we in the democratic world are serious about it, then we can no longer allow Kazakhstan, Venezuelan to purchase property anonymously in London or Miami. Okay, that's very true. But yeah, if you see London, more than 50%, I think it's owned by the Indians, if I'm not wrong, property, or the rulers of Angola and Myanmar to hide money in Delaware or Nevada. We need, in other words, to make changes to our system, and that may require overcoming fierce domestic resistance from the business group that benefit from it. We need to shut down tax havens, enforce money laundering laws, stop selling securities and surveillance technology to autocracies, and divest from the most vicious regime altogether. We here will need to include Europe, especially the UK, as well as the partners elsewhere, and that will require a lot of vigorous diplomacy. I'm surprised to see that she has not mentioned India even a single time. The same is true for fight for human rights. Statements made at a diplomatic summit won't achieve much if politicians, citizens, and businesses don't act as if they matter. To effect real changes, the Biden administration will have to ask hard questions and make big decisions.
How can we force Apple and Google to respect the rights of the Russian Democrats? How can we ensure that Western manufacturers have excluded from the supply chains anything produced in the Uyghur concentration camp? We need a major investment in independent media around the world, a strategy for reaching people inside autocracies, new international institution to replace the defunct human rights bodies in the UN. We need a way to coordinate democratic nations to respond from responses when autocracies commit crimes outside their borders, whether it's the Russian state murdering people in Berlin or Salisbury, England, the Belarusian dictators hijacking a commercial flight, or Chinese operatives harassing exiles in Washington D.C. As of now, we have no transnational strategy designed to confront these transnational problems. This absence of strategy reflects more than a negligence. The centralities of democracy to American foreign policy has been declining for many years, and about the same pace, perhaps not coincidentally, as the decline of respect for democracy in America itself. The Trump presidency was a 4-year display of a contempt not just for the American political process, but for America's historic democratic allies. So this was in 2011s. I'm surprised to see. I'm really excited to see her reactions when the Trump came again and all those things right now. What is happening? The Trump presidency was a 4-year display of a contempt not just for the American political process, but for America's historic democratic alliances. So we single out for abuse. The president described the British and German leaders as a losers and the candidate in a Canadian prime minister as a dishonest and weak, while he's cozied up to autocrats, the Turkish president, the Russian president, and the Saudi family ruling, and the North Korean dictators among them, with whom he felt more comfortable, and no wonder he has shared this ethos of no question asked investments for many years. In 2008, the Russian oligarch Dmitry Robov paid Trump $95 million, and more than twice what Trump had paid just 4 years earlier for a house in Palm Beach. No one else seemed to want. In 2012, Trump put his name on a building in Baku, Azerbaijan, owned by the company with apartment linked to the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps. Trump feels perfectly at home in autocracy, INC, and he accelerated the erosions of the rules and norms that has allowed it to take roots in America. At the same time, a part of an American left has abandoned the idea that democracy belongs at the heart of US foreign policy, not out of a greed and cynicism, but out of a loss of faith and democracy at home, convinced that the history of America is the history of a genocide, slavery, exploitations, and not much else. They don't see the value of making common cause with the Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, Nursimha Aburishita, or any other ordinary people around the world forced into politics by their direct experiences of profound injustice. Focused on America's own bitter problems, they no longer believe America has anything to offer to the rest of the world. Although now it has this entire thing, right? I mean, she was talking back in 2011. Now this entire thing is on steroids in terms of the thinking that, okay, America is good for nothing. They won't be able to provide any securities. So I think most of the people are pessimistic about the future of America, except America. Focused on America's own bitter problems. They no longer believe America has anything to offer to the rest of the world. Although the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters waving American flag believe many of them same thing what we believe. The request for America's support in 2019 did not elicit a significant wave of youthful activism in the United States, not even something comparable to the anti-apartheid movement of the 1980s. Incorrectly identifying the promotions of democracy around the world with a forever was, so they fail to understand that the brutality of the zero-sum competitions unfolding in front of us. Nature abhors a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does geopolitics. If America removes the promotions of democracy from its foreign policy, if America ceases to interest itself in the fate of other democracies and democratic movement, then autocracies will quickly take over place as a source of influence, funding, and idea. If Americans, together with their allies, fail to fight the habits and practice of autocracy abroad, we will encounter them at home. Indeed, they are already here. If Americans don't help to hold the murderous regime to account, so those regime will retain their sense of impunity. They will continue to steal, blackmail, torture, and intimidate inside their countries and inside us. So this is the end of it. And do I agree with what she is saying? No, I do. I actually have a very different perspective. I think what I believe is that now most of the countries are looking inward. Inward in a sense that I think America also, the Trump came to power because of the fact that the left, right, the Democratic parties are too liberal. For example, open borders and open support for LGBTQ. I'm not saying they shouldn't, right? I'm just talking about the facts. They're promoting LGBTQ, which I think which shouldn't, right? It's like, okay, so if you are a third gender, it's fine, but you don't have to promote it. You don't have to actively teach people to this is the advantages and this is this, and you have to convert. This is what was happening in America. right? So that's why most of the parents were concerned. First, second, open borders, and third, the incapacity of the government, and they're too liberal. So that's why I think most of the most of the liberal parties lost. So that's why the right conservative. So I now this is exactly what I see. The right conservative parties are coming up. Even in India, it's a right conservative party, but it's not like exactly like a right conservative. So it's like a mixture of both. But in terms of the they're like a more conservative people. Like most of the people are right now enforcing on a conservative parties, and not very conservative, quite a conservative parties. And second, yeah, even in a conservative, you can have a freedom of speech, right? And second is that I don't think that now that I think the democracy is spreading as far as I think, because if you see, you cannot control a country for a very long time in a dictatorship. There will be a civil war. There will be either civil war, or when the leader, that the leader comes up an age when he dies, or any of those things, there will be internal conflict, and I think democracy will prevail at the end. So I actually don't, yeah, for the time being, I do think that for the next 10-20 years, the autocracy will not go. The dictatorships, the China, Russia, all those, they will not go. But I think in the long run, like 50-60 years, I think the democracy will prevail in all over the world. You could see that in the Middle East, right? And you could see that in the Middle East, and you could see that in a lot of countries where when the people are unhappy, right, then it becomes very difficult. When people, like when the common people, if when the autocrats, right, the dictators, they're not able to control. When people are enough, the people are fed up with this, then they revolt, and then there is a civil war and all those things, and they topple the government, and then democracy will come. So I think I don't agree with her. That doesn't mean that she is wrong. She is right. She has a right to her own opinion. So I don't buy her opinion, thinking that for the time being, the autocracy people are winning. Winning is also not the right words. They're not declining, yes, but I think ultimately the democracy will prevail. I think, and even in a democracy, right, it's not like a full democracy. Even in a democracy, there are certain limitations with respect to the fact that you cannot say something against the certain religious or any of those things which would constitute a violent, or which would incite a violence, or those thing condition. I mean, democracy with a condition applied. Then is it a democracy? Yeah. Now there comes a democracy, flawed democracy, all those things, but largely democracy. So yeah, even India considers a democracy, but you cannot say. I'm not saying this thing. Okay, so the problem here is that India is a democracy. The problem with the democracy, Indian democracy, is that if someone is making a statement which is hurtful or which is not a normal, then the government shouldn't come in. The government should not come in, right? Unless he is making inciting a violence or a mob or any of the things. For example, if a comedian, right? I'll give you an example of Samir Raina. He makes some jokes, and along with the Ranveer Allahabadiya, he makes some jokes about some mother. Do you want to join in a sex with a mother and all those things? Do I like it? No, I didn't like it. But does he have the right to say it? Yes, he has a right to say it, because we live in a democracy. And does government has any job to interfere in any of those things? No, I don't think they have any interference. They have any jobs. The government, but they filed in a fire, which I think it is wrong. So see, okay, here in a democracy, right? When something is wrong, then when someone says something about a joke or any of those things, then the government shouldn't step in. But if the society at large didn't like it, then yeah, society can punish. For example, the government shouldn't come in. Instead, if the society doesn't like it, boycott him. Don't look at his videos. Don't look at this one. Just boycott him. We can pressure through society. But when the government comes in, then it becomes a problem, because then you have to set the limit of what is the extent, you have to draw a line, which is very difficult. So that's why my thing is that we need to have an absolute freedom of speech, and if the government is not liking it, they can't do any of those things. Even the police can't do any of those things. But yeah, except there are some conditions with inciting violence and all those things. Otherwise, they have a right to say whatever they want, and if the people at large don't like it, they can't file an FIR, right? If they don't like it, give them a societal, what do I say, punishments, boycott them. That's the best they can do. Not FIR and then military comes in, all those things, jail them. No, that's not democracy. That's not an absolute freedom. So yeah, that's my opinion. And thank you.